Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, for joining us around the world. First, let me know if you in the chat if you all can hear me okay. Okay, great. My name is Aaron Schumann. I'm the Director of Growth here at Gatsby. In this hour, we're going to be covering headless WordPress using Gatsby's latest completely rewritten integration. Your presenters today will be Hashim Warren, Senior Product Marketer at Gatsby, who will be joined by Jack Sellwood, Senior Product Manager at Gatsby. And before we get started, we wanted to launch a poll to understand what kind of developer you consider yourself to be. So let me go ahead and launch that. You want to know if you're a WordPress developer, do you consider yourself to be a React developer, both or neither? So while we wait for those poll results to come in, just a couple programming notes. Today's webinar will be recorded and we'll share it with everybody who's registered for the event. And then we'll also include some additional technical resources that couldn't fit into the hour we have today. All right, great. We've got some results coming in. Give it a few more seconds for that. Okay, so pretty even split today. We've got about roughly 30% of people consider themselves WordPress developers, about 23% consider themselves React, 28% both, and 18% neither. So thanks for everybody who responded to that. It actually really helps us tailor how we're going to be working through the rest of the presentation. So with that said, let's kick it off and hand it over to Hashim.
Hello, everyone. Today, we're going to talk about Gatsby's WordPress integration and how you can use this new architecture to create a fast and secure website that meets your clients' or your organization's goals. So if you're a React developer, like 23% of you say that you are, and you're tasked with choosing a CMS, we have a few things to think about as you're choosing whether WordPress meets your needs. And if you're already a WordPress developer, which it looks like 32% of you are, then we have a few best practices that will help you to adopt Gatsby and skill up on this stack. So thank you for joining us. At the end, we will have Q&A where you can ask us questions about the presentation or about the integration or anything you want about Gatsby and headless WordPress. So my name is Hashim Warren. As you already heard, I'm the Senior Product Marketing Manager for Gatsby. You can follow me on Twitter where I tweet about web development, I tweet about marketing, Gatsby, WordPress, and everything in between. And Jack, please tell us who you are. Just a quick note, Jack, if you are speaking, can I hear you right now?
Hey Hashim, sorry about that. I think my internet cut out for a minute. Hey everyone, I'm Jack Sellwood, Senior Product Manager at Gatsby. I joined here last summer and it's been awesome to work with the team. Before that, I spent almost 10 years building WordPress sites and running a small little agency out of Minneapolis. So excited to talk today about WordPress and dig in. Fantastic, thanks so much, Hashim. So today we're going to talk about Gatsby's integration with WordPress and how this kind of mixes the best of both worlds. Content editors love the intuitive, easy interface in WordPress, and increasingly devs are looking for more seamless and fantastic front-end experience. And our new WordPress integration makes this possible. We've been hard at work on this for a couple years now, and Gatsby Source WordPress version 4 went general availability about a month ago. And to just walk through some of those benefits, Hashim, you can hit next. I just want to talk through some of the benefits. And so now finally content editors can preview before they publish. No more will you have to publish content and quickly share the URL with folks to get approval. You can actually preview it before you go live. Build times are incredibly fast thanks to incremental builds on Gatsby Cloud. You can get sub 10-second builds and previews on Gatsby Cloud. And then finally, to boost your SEO, your core web vitals, and visitor experience, the performance of your site is just fantastic. And an interesting study from Google a few years ago showed that 50% of users will bounce if your site takes longer than 3 seconds to load. So Gatsby plus WordPress delivers this fantastic page speed. And then unique to maybe what you're used to building a monolithic WordPress site, Gatsby brings rock solid security to the front end for the first time. I remember when I was running my agency, we would constantly be dealing with updating plugins, working with clients to make sure they weren't installing new ones. All of that security, all those headaches go away when you swap out Gatsby for the front end. So now back to Hashim to dig more into the details.
So what's really exciting about this integration is that it fulfills a unique mission that we have at Gatsby to accelerate the work of the entire website team. So for us, that doesn't mean just developers and developer experience. It means developers and marketers using the tools that best help their workflows. And I'm very excited about this because I've spent over 10 years being a marketer and I'm a new web developer. So being able to use a tool like Gatsby and also being able to use a tool like WordPress, just even for my self-contained projects, is really exciting for me. But also at Gatsby, we use obviously Gatsby on our front end, but WordPress to power our blog. So I am also a user of Gatsby and WordPress, at work at Gatsby. By the way, we also use Contentful, Airtable. We pull data from a Postgres database. So we pull data from a lot of different places. Airtable also. And each team gets to decide which tool they want to use. And for the marketing team, for what we needed, we chose WordPress for the blog. If you're interested in diving into why we chose WordPress, I wrote an article about it. You can just search why Gatsby chose WordPress, and you can see that there. So one thing that makes Gatsby incredible is that you can meet your team's performance goals and also your accessibility goals and also your SEO goals. You can get 80% of the way there without any other optimization just by using Gatsby. And then get the rest of the way there with a few tweaks on your own. But after you have met your performance requirements, the question is, what drives the success of your website? And that's what we want to go into. And we see that the success of a marketing website depends on not just your performance and page speed, not just your accessibility, not just your technical SEO, but also the quality and quantity of your content. And this is a really tough arena for marketers. And sometimes it's hard for web developers on the team to understand it, but reader expectation is high here. Customer expectation is high when it comes to the information, the content on your website, and also the competition is fierce. So this chart is from SEMrush, a marketing tool that does its own crawl of the web and has thousands of customers where they have access to their Google Analytics, they have access to their Google Search Console. So SEMrush, they did a study and they wanted to know the best performing content, what characteristics does it share? And they found something that was really surprising. What they found was that 7,000 plus word articles drive almost 4 times more traffic and 43% more shares than articles of average length. So, 900 to 1,200 word articles. So in order to produce this type of content, this type of high quality content, often it takes original research, often it takes editing from multiple people, a writer, an editor, a copy editor. Often it takes original artwork or original charts that you have in this content. To really succeed in the really competitive world of digital marketing, your content has to be spectacular and it needs to be at least 1,200 words to be average and 7,000 words in order to compete and gain 4 times more traffic and rankings and shares and things like that. So this is really difficult for the marketer. And you can imagine that they want to choose their own tools. So at Gatsby, we believe that a content editor's experience matters. It matters just like a developer's experience matters. So we want to give both content editors, we want to give um, web developers who have to make architectural decisions about the website the freedom and choice to allow their content editors, their marketers, to choose whatever CMS they want. And that is a unique capability of Gatsby. When we chose WordPress for our blog, and also the documentation team decided to stay with using Markdown for the documentation part of the site. For the web developers who manage our site, it's just the same thing. It's just more data coming into Gatsby's GraphQL layer, and they can make pages based on it like that, and they don't have to dive deep into the actual CMS. So Gatsby gives you that freedom, but what we're advising is don't use that freedom you have to work with any CMS and any data source to push the marketing team into a specific CMS. Let them choose the CMS that works best with their workflow. So just a few stats about that. Marketers and website owners, they're choosing WordPress, and for many different reasons that we'll go into in a little bit. But we see that 65% of all the websites whose content management system is known is based on WordPress, and that's a stat from W3 Techs. And I want to just compare that to a few tools that web developers are familiar with, especially this audience, where many of you are React developers. So according to NPM, over 60% of survey respondents say they're using React. So if you're a React developer, imagine the marketer saying you have to use Vue or some other front-end library. You can use it, but I'm sure it'll slow down your workflow. Or Stack Overflow developer survey said that Visual Studio Code is used by 50% of the respondents. So imagine having to use a code editor that someone else told you have to use for a project. You could use it, but it would slow down your workflow. So whether it's WordPress or another CMS, Gatsby allows you to give your developers, your content editors, a choice of anything. And that's why we wanted to make our WordPress integration awesome for the content editor. So if you're deciding to transition your all-in-one WordPress project to headless, we have a few things that you want to keep in mind, and we also want to answer a few questions that we've received over the past few months as people were using the beta version of our WordPress integration. And one of those big questions is, what do I do about all the plugins that I use for my WordPress project? My content editors, they rely on these plugins. I rely on these plugins for my web development. And we have some good news, and that is we did a survey of the top 100 WordPress plugins based on the WordPress.org site that shows the popular plugins. And we found that 33% of those plugins work as is with Gatsby. So basically, any plugin that does not touch the front end, any plugin that has to do with roles and responsibilities, roles and access of editors, or security, or backup, or media optimization, database backup plugins like Backup Buddy, media optimization plugins like Smush or Ew, or is it EWWW? I have to ask someone. Or security plugins like Limit Login Attempts, or Security, or access and role management plugins like User Role Editor. These plugins, they all just work with Gatsby. And one thing that I'm really excited by is that the more that WordPress is used as a headless CMS, I think the more innovation we'll see in these categories of plugins. Already, WordPress is really great for this. And one of the reasons why Gatsby chose WordPress is because we have a lot of guest editors who need to access the site to publish their article. We can control their roles and permissions really well with WordPress. and also not be charged per seat when we need to allow them in. So I think WordPress is going to become even better at these sorts of problems, and it's already great right now. So 33% of the most popular WordPress plugins work as is with Gatsby, and that's because they don't touch anything on the front end. Now, there's another class of plugins where for Gatsby just replaces the needs for those plugins. And those are often performance-focused WordPress plugins. You think of caching plugins like W3 Total Cache or Supercache, or again, media optimization plugins. You can actually use those, with your Gatsby WordPress integration to optimize your images and media, or Gatsby itself, using Gatsby Image, can optimize that content. So it completely replaces a whole class of plugins that you may have been using either for free or the premium version for your projects. So some plugins work as is. Gatsby replaces the use of other plugins. Some WordPress plugins can work with Gatsby, a Gatsby front end, via a WP GraphQL extension. So if you're completely new to our integration, one of the dependencies of our integration is called WP GraphQL, which is a free WordPress plugin that puts a GraphQL server, an endpoint into your WordPress project. So now you can access your content and data and also publish to WordPress through a GraphQL endpoint. So what's amazing about WP GraphQL is that other plugins where you want access to the data created by those plugins or created through those plugins, other plugins can make that data available if you just install an extension to WP GraphQL. So a few examples of that is custom post type UI. There's an extension for WP GraphQL that makes that useful with a Gatsby project. Same thing with advanced customs field, Yoast SEO, the events calendar. I absolutely love this part of our integration, this capability, because imagine using another CMS where you have to create the content model for an events calendar, by yourself. And it seems simple at first, and then not just to build the model, but also to build the editing screen for it is just very difficult. But the events calendar, a plugin I've used myself, a plugin I've paid for, just works really well. And same thing for Yoast SEO. Yoast SEO is going to continue to keep up to date with all of Google and Bing's SEO best practices. And as they update their plugin, it's just available for your content editor. It's available for your front end. You don't have to recreate that yourself. So I'm really excited that these plugins for WordPress are still made useful with a WP GraphQL extension. And this is not the complete list. And there's more plugins, more extensions like this in development. So this part of the ecosystem is growing. Now, the thing that makes Gatsby incredibly unique is that we have a library of 2,500 plus plugins and growing that are free alternatives to many popular WordPress plugins. So these are plugins like a Gatsby plugin for Google Analytics or Google Tag Manager, Facebook Analytics. You can create an XML sitemap and more. So this is really exciting to see because many of the Gatsby alternatives give you every option that you need for that integration without charging you or upselling you like some WordPress plugins do, which is totally fine, but it's also an extra capability that you have where you get to use all of the options that you need for Google Analytics plugin or Google Tag Manager, and it's completely free. So you have some plugins that completely work with Gatsby, some plugins that Gatsby completely replaces, other plugins that can work with Gatsby if you use an extension, and then you have plugins that Gatsby replaces because of our large library of Gatsby plugins, and that's unique to Gatsby. So now another thing that's often surprising to people or surprising to WordPress developers or developers who are new to Gatsby is that essentially Gatsby, your Gatsby website is a React app. So in the same way, so many React libraries can be used with Gatsby just as is. And there are caveats to that, and we have articles on our website about which libraries you can use or not. But I've seen people use beautiful component libraries to kick off the design of their website and still make that website accessible and performant and follow SEO best practices. And there's a lot of rich React libraries they can use to really supercharge your Gatsby project. So not only are there Gatsby plugins, but you have access to React libraries for your site also. So we gave you a lot of information about migrating to from all-in-one WordPress to using headless WordPress with Gatsby. But since we've done it ourselves and since we've helped many companies migrate, we're offering you the ability to work with us if you need help migrating to the stack. So if you need recommendations on the setup for your content editors, or which plugins you should use, or how to handle hosting, we can give you those recommendations. We can also help you with onboarding sessions, whether it's for your the developers on your team or for your content editors. We can also help you with baseline performance audits so that you can, like I said, Gatsby gets you 80% of the way. And then there's other things that you can do that are specific to your website project that we can help you with. So if you're interested in that, go to the link there, or you can search Gatsby.js Concierge, and we can give you help with that. So with that said, we would love to open it up for anyone who has questions about our integration with WordPress or any of the information that we shared during this presentation, or any questions that you have about Gatsby or headless WordPress in general. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hashim.
Howdy.
Let's bring in Jack, answer a few of the questions that we got throughout the presentation.
Fantastic. So we have a question here. How does, excuse me, how does Gatsby handle Gutenberg editor content? So super great question. So out of the box, the Gatsby source WordPress plugin is compatible with Gutenberg. But in this scenario, it's really only compatible with Gutenberg as an upgraded form of WYSIWYG. So, all of the basic Gutenberg blocks like images, headings, those types of things work great when they're pulled into your Gatsby front end. However, there are challenges with more custom blocks, specifically ACF blocks that you build in Gutenberg. And so what we typically recommend is that you go, with Gutenberg, maybe for simple page layouts like blog posts, and then maybe something like ACF flexible content field types for more structured pages, and sort of use those two paradigms accordingly.
And just to give you an example, for the Gatsby website, we do use ACF flexible fields, and it gives us a little mini page builder experience for our content editors, and I'm one of them. But for my personal website, I'm using Gutenberg without any of the custom blocks, and that works well for me there using Gatsby. So depending on how you need to publish the content, that's what we recommend.
Fantastic. We have another question here. How do you trigger a build once content has been published in WordPress? So super great example. So there's actually 3 things sort of involved in building a Gatsby plus WordPress site. The first thing is the WP GraphQL plugin to expose a GraphQL API into WordPress, which supercharges the Gatsby source WordPress source plugin that lives on the Gatsby side. But in between those two, you have WP Gatsby, which is another plugin you'll install from WordPress.org. And that's where you configure things like preview and webhooks so that you can automatically trigger builds when WordPress content changes. WP Gatsby got a major overhaul for its 1.0 release last month. We rebuilt how data changes are detected, so it's really performant now. And when you pair with Gatsby Cloud and incremental builds, it's super speedy.
And I also want to reiterate that everyone who signed up for this webinar, you can receive a technical demo of how the integration works, including how those updates get sent over to Gatsby Cloud. And it's led by the engineers who worked on it. And it's a great overview and demo of how to build your first project with Gatsby and WordPress.
Super awesome. Kind of transitioning, there were several questions about WooCommerce and e-commerce in the chat. And so someone was wondering, can this be used with WooCommerce? If so, how complex is it to integrate? So last week at GatsbyConf, we announced a brand new source plugin, Gatsby Source Shopify Experimental, which supports incremental builds and previews. We've seen a lot of folks successfully build Gatsby plus Shopify sites, but we also realize and acknowledge that WooCommerce is, if not, it's one of the most, if not the most popular e-commerce platforms on the web. So it's definitely something that we're taking a look at. It's a pretty tall order. Again, if you've sort of followed along with our adventures with WP Gatsby and WP GraphQL, bringing WordPress, which is traditionally monolithic, into the future can be challenging. So we're definitely considering bringing WooCommerce support in the future. Today, though, what you can do, and actually what I've talked to a lot of users is they'll use Gatsby with WordPress for content, and then they'll pull in Shopify for e-commerce. Businesses love Shopify because it's such a simple and easy to use sort of line of business application for managing orders and fulfilling orders. And so we'll see people combine Shopify and WordPress together for a great content editing experience and a great e-commerce experience.
And I did not put this on the slide about WP GraphQL, but there is an extension for WooCommerce, but I believe that extension is early in its development. But just like you said, Jack, when I worked at an agency, we migrated our clients' websites to have everything in WordPress. So your store in WordPress and your blog in WordPress and everything in WordPress. And one of the exciting things that I've enjoyed at Gatsby is that when I need to work on the store, I can go to Shopify and it's purpose built for that. And I can use WordPress for something else. So if you're running an agency, it really gives you an extra superpower that you don't need to specialize just on one CMS, but you can specialize on Gatsby and then use multiple CMSs.
Awesome, Hashim. And I think someone just mentioned Rudis.com is a Gatsby plus WP GraphQL plus WooCommerce site. So there's one in the wild for you. We had a couple questions come in about internationalization and multilingual support. So a lot of this is predicated on whether or not there's a WP GraphQL extension. The WP Gatsby plugin will interpret that data from WP GraphQL. And so there is an extension for WP GraphQL for Polylang that you can implement in Gatsby. Of course, something more turnkey in the future would be great. And we'll consider that for the future. Awesome. So we had a couple other questions in the chat, just sort of generally about WordPress plugins and how those work with Gatsby sites. And Hashim touched on this a little bit. So all of the performance plugins, all of the optimization plugins that you have to optimize images or optimize your WordPress front end, you don't need those with Gatsby. And those are very commonly an attack vector for hackers or for bots. And so I'm thinking about Gatsby, a lot of that attack surface is taken away. So any of the remaining plugins you have typically enhance the content editor experience. And a lot of those, you can update less regularly or enable automatic updates as of WordPress 5.6 and sort of use that going forward. Similarly, on that topic, and the Gatsby source WordPress source plugin supports this, you can enable basic HTTP auth for your WordPress site. Essentially putting an authentication screen to even access it, which is a great form of security. And if you put that in front of the site, there isn't going to be any public traffic that hits it, and so that's a fantastic way to secure your site. Even if you're still going to have some of those plugins installed.
Jack, I have a little case study that just happened to me a few days ago.
Yeah.
So I wish I thought of this for the presentation, but I had a Rowdy plugin make it impossible for me to log into my site. So I had to SSH into it, delete the plugin folder and everything else, but no hiccup to my site at all. Like no hiccup to my site. Where if I was using all-in-one WordPress, it would have been a problem. But the only time my front end cares about WordPress is during the build. So that was even though it was a headache fixing what that plugin was doing, to my site visitors, no difference. So I need to actually write a blog post about that. That just happened a few days ago, and it was no hiccup for the front end.
Fantastic. I'll look here for a couple more questions. So there's been a couple questions about page builders and how they're supported with Gatsby. So this is an area of interest to us, just sort of the page building experience in general at Gatsby, but also specifically considering it for WordPress. Again, a lot of this is predicated on whether or not there is an extension for WP GraphQL from these page builders. To the best of my knowledge, there is not one really for Divi or Elementor, some of the popular ones. Gutenberg is the best page builder if you're going to use Gatsby as the front end. And if you really want to kind of go crazy with things, you can build React components for Gutenberg and reuse those React components on the Gatsby front end. There is a limitation there in that there's not a server-side registry of Gutenberg blocks, and so that makes it difficult for WP GraphQL to expose all of those. And so that's something that we'll continue to push the WordPress core team. I know Jason Ball has a few thoughts and feelings about that, and it'd be awesome to see a server-side registry for Gutenberg blocks someday. And so that's something we'll work towards. We had several questions come in about forms, really fantastic topic. So Gravity Forms is working on, I believe they already have a WP GraphQL extension, and they've been working on a source plugin for Gatsby that I believe is in beta or something like that. We've been in limited communication with them to try and support their efforts. So this is definitely something that we're keen to invest in. Thinking about WordPress, traditionally how it's used, everything is handled. Your forms, all the functionality of your site is handled through sort of that one monolith. And traditionally in the Jamstack, you would separate all those services out. So you'd have your forms maybe be powered by HubSpot or some third-party service, and sort of separate out all the individual pieces. Well, when you use Gatsby with WordPress, you can kind of meet somewhere in the middle and use WordPress for content and also kind of as a backend for some things. So in a theoretical scenario where you don't want to have 10 platforms powering everything, you could say have WordPress power your content, WooCommerce have power the e-commerce portion of your site, and then maybe something like Gravity Forms to power the forms. And so all of that is still conveniently located in WP admin, but this doesn't require sort of all those disparate services. So I'd say continue to look for that a mature version of the Gravity Forms source plugin that can write data back to WordPress and start there.
I'll give an example that we're using right now. So at Gatsby, again, we use ACF's flexible fields, and we have one field for our form, and it sends data to our front end, and it uses props to change the name of the field, the key that we're sending to the endpoint, and things like that, so that our content editors can add a form to a page. And also send it to the right, we're using HubSpot, send it to the right list in HubSpot. I'm also personally experimenting with a new service called Formium, which is purpose-built for sites like Gatsby. And it builds itself as a headless form builder, where a content editor would log into Formium, change a form or create a form, and also it will kick off a build that will update the page for the form. What's exciting about Formium is that it works within the component library that you're already using. So one of the issues that I had with optimizing my all-in-one WordPress site in the past was I was using a form builder that I really loved in terms of the power it gave me, but it was also loading jQuery on pages where it wasn't used. It was loading the CSS on pages that wasn't used. And it was just a beast to optimize my site while having the power that I have as a content editor. So this is a new place that we're all at in terms of what's the best practice in terms of building of forums. But again, at Gatsby, we have a form builder that we've created within ACF. There's also services that want to specifically work with static sites, headless form builders that will work with your static site without impacting performance. So there are trade-offs, but I think these are some worthwhile trade-offs.
Absolutely. We have a couple more questions in the chat. Do you need high-performance WordPress hosting with Gatsby? Fantastic question. If you head on over to the Gatsby source WordPress repo, there's a great README in there that talks about WordPress hosting, and I can share a little bit now about it as well. So I would generally avoid shared hosting with WordPress, but especially if you want to maintain quick build times and quick previews. And so Gatsby source WordPress is still, at the end of the day, going to be making GraphQL requests back to your WordPress install. And that WordPress install needs to serve that data, including images, to your build process, not when your site's live, but during the build process. And so we've seen with some shared hosts, they throttle the IO access for pulling images, or they throttle database access, or you're just on another server with so many other sites that performance isn't great. So you still want a good host. Managed hosts like WP Engine or Flywheel or Pantheon work great with Gatsby because typically you have, if not dedicated resources, reserved resources, so you can make all those requests. And if you just if you bring a faster server to the build process, your build will be even faster. So you can kind of optimize your WordPress install and your WordPress hosting for the performance you're expecting, for the build. Awesome. So we have another question here about how to prevent indexing of your WordPress backend. So, and I kind of touched on this earlier a little bit with HTTP basic auth, but and I believe there's a couple WordPress hosts that are actually sort of reimagining WordPress hosting for the Jamstack world. Shifter.io comes to mind, and Hashim, do you remember the other? Stratic and Shifter are the two that come to mind most frequently. I know with WP Engine and Flywheel you could do the same thing. But if you enable HTTP basic auth, which on WP Engine and Flywheel I think is called privacy mode, it throws a browser authentication page up. So before you even get to WP admin, before you even visit the front of the site, there's that page there. That's sort of a brute force or foolproof way to make sure that your WordPress backend isn't indexed by search engines. There's also a headless mode theme on WordPress.org, and we've also considered introducing sort of a headless mode to the WP Gatsby Stores plugin to kind of make that easier. So I would first check with your host to see if you can enable HTTP basic auth or install that headless mode WordPress theme. Fantastic. We've had some questions here about setting up Preview without Gatsby Cloud. So WP Gatsby, the plugin that you install on your WordPress site from WordPress.org, does work without Gatsby Cloud. It's a little bit more of a manual provisioning process. You will need a Preview instance hosted somewhere. So if that's on Nullify, for example, you'll paste your Nullify webhook information into WP Gatsby instead of your Gatsby Cloud webhook URL. Unfortunately, incremental builds is something that we worked really hard on for years, and so that's only available on Gatsby Cloud. So you can still get what we call fast builds on other hosts, or fast preview on other hosts. And this is detailed and a little bit more in depth in the Gatsby source WordPress repo, in the README, sort of explaining how to set this up, regardless of where your host or preview instance is at, and also the difference between sort of a cold build, a fast build, and an incremental build, and the performance you can expect from those. Are there any Gatsby themes which mimic the Gutenberg look and feel so the theme design in WordPress is reflected on the front end? This is the holy grail, right? Of course, that you could do a component-driven, you could do component-driven design in Gutenberg and see that, almost one for one reflected in your front end. And, I personally know a few companies that are working on this problem. It's something that we're thinking about. We haven't thrown our hat into the ring yet. There's a really interesting project, and I'll follow up and include the Twitter link after this. But there was a project someone had rebuilt. I think it was the last week or 2 weeks ago. Someone had rebuilt, I believe, the 2020 theme so that the Gatsby front end was natively supported in Customizer and sort of supported all the features from Gutenberg and all the block styling one for one. This is something that me and some of the other designers at Gatsby and engineers have been thinking about. WordPress has a really solid theming layer where you can browse and explore themes in the gallery and install them. So we're trying to think, how can we bring that to Gatsby? Is that something we want to bring to Gatsby? Is that what people are expecting? So this isn't a solved problem yet, but there's sort of some experimental projects out there that you can try. So someone had asked a question clarifying some new features in Gatsby version 3. I thought incremental builds were available without Gatsby Cloud for Gatsby version 3. So build performance, especially cold builds, the time that it takes for Gatsby develop to run locally, significantly improved with Gatsby 3, due to making processing nodes faster and also fetching data more efficiently. So it's way faster, but it's still not sort of the core incremental builds technology, which looks just at which nodes and which pages need to be refreshed and does so accordingly. So it's not that full incremental builds experience, but it's a lot more performant and a little bit closer. Just looking through all the questions here. Hashim, is there anything you want to touch on while I catch up on the questions?
No.
I just found a good one. Is there a plan to create a feature we can buy domains on Gatsby cloud hosting? Super great question. I previously worked at Flywheel, and this was a question that we got there a lot. Buying domains, managing DNS, those are really tricky problems, especially if you think about it, you might not be a customer with Gatsby Cloud forever, or maybe you use Gatsby for some projects but not others. There's just a lot of edge cases when you think about domain registration and DNS. My two favorite domain registrars are Cloudflare and Hover because they're so simple. While you won't need Cloudflare CDN with Gatsby Cloud, it does give you a really effective pricing for domain registration. And it's super easy to connect that with Fastly, which is the edge provider that we use on Gatsby Cloud. And of course, no matter where you register your domain, you can enable free SSL certificates or bring your own on Gatsby Cloud hosting.
So I have a question that we talked about earlier. For agencies, how do you suggest positioning headless WordPress to clients? And Jack, I know you ran an agency before. So how would you position headless WordPress to clients?
Fantastic question. Gosh, I built so many WordPress sites over the years, and I was actually, despite being such an avid ACF fan, I was a pretty early adopter of Gutenberg. I don't know if anyone in the audience remembers Site Origins Page Builder, which used it took any WordPress widget and sort of turned it into a block in their page builder. And to me, that was kind of the first version of Gutenberg because it was like the most native page builder that was available for WordPress. And so, sort of a sidetrack, but point being, I'm always interested, when I was running Wedge, my old agency, sort of in the latest and greatest ways of building WordPress sites. So what I've heard work really effectively is just to present two solutions. Typically when a client comes to an agency and says, hey, we have this project, in about 5 minutes, you know what stack that you'd like to go with on the project. But if you can pull back a little bit and say, okay, my client doesn't know necessarily what Gatsby is, they don't know what headless means, they don't know what Jamstack means, but they're maybe asking for WordPress. If you present two solutions side by side, costs for both, be transparent, and you say, here's the benefits of WordPress, here's the benefits of WordPress plus Gatsby setup, sort of walk them through maybe some of the rough edges or benefits that you can assist them in the decision-making process instead of telling them this is exactly what we're going to do. Helping educate them can be a part of the sales process at an agency. And I guess one more thing I would add is for a lot of small businesses, for a lot of those sort of brochure style sites that make up so much of the WordPress market and of agencies' projects, Gatsby, is an obvious choice, because what those types of sites are looking for is great SEO, really fantastic performance, especially, if you think of a small business, especially right now, so much traffic, so many brand impressions happen online as opposed to in sort of the physical world. And so those benefits of, fast performance, good SEO, progressive web app features, like, really, really great, easy offline support. You get all those things with Gatsby, which for a lot of small businesses, they don't update content, they're maybe not rigorously updating their WordPress site. And so Gatsby is a really, really awesome choice for them. On the WordPress side, you have to worry about plugins and security and things like that. If your client is a WordPress expert and they want to install a bunch of WordPress plugins and have that flexibility, then maybe a monolithic WordPress is a better choice for them. But if they're looking to you as an agency to sort of build an all-in-one thing that's, all-in-one site that is best in breed, then, present those two solutions side by side, and hopefully they'll choose the Gatsby one.
And also another question is, what if your team is new to React and GraphQL? How much do they need to know before they get started? And what's the best place to learn?
Oh gosh. So, Hashim, do you want to take this one, or do you want me to respond?
We both probably have different slices of the same story, but yeah. For me, Gatsby was the way that I started to learn React. And when I joined Gatsby, I learned that at least two of my coworkers learned React through Gatsby. Both of them were designers, and they learned React through Gatsby. So I recently wrote an article on creating a photo blog using WordPress and Gatsby with no coding. You're not writing WP. I'm sorry. You're not writing GraphQL. You're not writing React. You're not writing PHP. You're just using the starter that we give you. You're just using WordPress. You're just configuring it. And then if you take that and start to add pages, you can basically learn how to drive the car before you customize it. So we think that Gatsby, we've heard from people that Gatsby is a great learning tool when it comes to the stack. So if your agency or your organization wants to adopt this new architecture, you can set up a small project and then have your team learn through it. And that's one of the great things about using a framework like Gatsby. Our documentation is is the first time I heard some of these words about CI/CD tools and CDNs and things like that. So in our docs, we have conceptual guides that helps you to get a lay of the land in terms of the whole architecture. Then we have how-to guides that will help you to build out your project. So our documentation is a great place to start. And our starter for our WordPress integration is a great place to start.
That is a much more thorough answer than I would have provided. I am in the trenches of this transition and sort of reteaching right now after having written so much PHP and jQuery and sort of making the transition to Gatsby. So.
And I think awesome. After we were at a conference, we were at the last in-person WordCamp US conference, and when we were talking to people about Gatsby and also GraphQL, we found that GraphQL sounded confusing until we showed people making a query and getting back the data. Then it was like that recognition of, oh, this is cool. I understand this. And all of a sudden it becomes less confusing, less scary. For me, it's become fun. And I think because of tools like Gatsby, where I'm no longer, configuring my Webpack, project, or no longer configuring Babel. I'm just templating pages, really. It's made things a lot more fun in terms of learning.
Totally. Thank you for those tips. I will internalize them as well. There were a couple more questions that came in the chat, and I'm kind of leaning back to avoid the glare of beautiful sunshine here in Omaha, Nebraska. But the question that came in, you mentioned forms earlier. Are there plans to include form handling in Gatsby Cloud? So we announced an early access beta of serverless functions on Gatsby Cloud at GatsbyConf last week. So head over to gatsbyjs.com/cloud to find details on that. So you can use that to handle forms. Obviously, we're thinking about sort of a more turnkey form-specific feature for Gatsby Cloud. No details on that yet, but we are working presently on serverless functions on Gatsby Cloud.
I want to say too, just so the first time I heard about serverless functions was coming into this Jamstack world, and it was another thing that was scary for me. But I just told the story on a Twitter Spaces chat, so it might be helpful here. But I wanted to send form data to MailChimp. So I'm reading MailChimp's API instructions and what it expects. I go into Postman, I work it out. Postman has this export feature that exports your code for Node. So I literally just exported it. I copy pasted it into my serverless function and then ran my serverless function. I was using AWS. I put a API gateway in front of it, hit the endpoint with my form, and it worked. And I was like, did I code today? So serverless functions, there's a lot of information out there that makes it sound confusing, but actually I find it less confusing than, I find it just as confusing or hard as using Zapier, which I've used a lot in the past. I'm just configuring things together. So I think no matter where you're coming from, WordPress, or if you're coming from React, using serverless functions is going to be a lot of fun for people. You might find it easier to put together serverless functions and just give your editors a few options in the editing field than even using full-blown form builders that might slow down your performance and other things like that.
Totally. Since we're on the topic of serverless functions in Gatsby Cloud, I thought this would be a good question. Someone mentioned they're curious about the advantage to switching from Netlify to Gatsby Cloud. So great question. Hashim, do you want to take this one?
The advantages of switching from Netlify to Gatsby Cloud?
Mm-hmm.
Well, Netlify, the first time I used Gatsby, I used it with Netlify. And the first thing is, because Gatsby is focused on building Gatsby sites, even though we have faster builds for any CI/CD tool you use, Gatsby has always been faster for me. I've also used Amplify from AWS, and I used it at the same time I was using Gatsby Cloud because I'm just pointing my my repo to different tools. So anyway, I found that my site consistently built faster on Gatsby Cloud, and then I was using Netlify for their CDN. So I was still using that Gatsby Cloud and Netlify. But once I was able to use internally Gatsby hosting and our CDN, I switched over, and it works perfectly. And my deploy times were faster too. So both my build times and deploy times became faster. So for me as a user, slowly I was weaned off of Netlify. Even though I love Netlify, Gatsby Cloud just made more sense with my Gatsby product, with my Gatsby project. And now that we have hosting, I didn't need Netlify at all for it. So that's a personal story of switching from Netlify to Gatsby Cloud.
Awesome. We have one more question in here that is a favorite of mine, so I just want to make sure we get time to bring it up. Someone mentioned that they first learned Gatsby through React, Gatsby, and Shopify, and that they're considering expanding their stack of tools that they use. I think I mentioned earlier, but I'll just reiterate, because of Gatsby's content mesh, we see people combine Gatsby with one or more CMSs or tools to power their site. And if you are building with Shopify, WordPress and Contentful, from what we've seen, are the two most popular sort of supporting CMSs. WordPress and Contentful both are fantastic for managing marketing content, for managing blog posts, and sort of pairing with another platform that might have strengths in other areas. So Fantastic. Someone had asked a question, what about images and sort of CDN, and does that work with the new Gatsby image plugin? Super great question. And so with Gatsby Source Shopify Experimental, I know I keep going back to this Shopify Source plugin, but we're sort of testing out and sort of pushing the bounds of Source plugins with that one. And we're planning to bring more of those innovations back to WordPress. And so with Gatsby Source Shopify Experimental and Gatsby Source WordPress, you can disable image processing and just serve those images from either your WordPress install or Shopify, and sort of eliminate processing there. The new Shopify Source plugin, though, is compatible with the new Gatsby plugin image. So you get all those benefits of Gatsby plugin image without doing all that local processing with Sharp of images. And so we want to bring that same level of support into all of our source plugins, but especially WordPress, since we know it's so popular. So we're working on that, and we'll have more to announce later. So thanks so much, everyone. I'll hand it back to Aaron to kind of conclude and wrap things up.
Thank you, Jack and Hashim, and thank you everyone for joining and for all of your questions. We'll be following up later on today with a recording, which you can view and share, as well as the recording of the technical demonstration. So thank you so much, and everyone have a great day, great evening, or great afternoon. Goodbye.